Thank you for coming out this morning. I have next to me, there's really no introduction that's going to do it justice. So I'm just synth pioneer, Morton Subotnick. I wanted to begin with something I guess people may not know so much about, which is synth certainly didn't come first for you. It was a pretty normal instrument. It was the clarinet that you started out with.
Yeah, I started out with a clarinet. When I started out with a clarinet, it must have been 1939. I think it was before most people were born here.
There was. Why did you choose the clarinet?
I was living in Los Angeles in an area that was mostly immigrants, Eastern European Jews and African Americans and Mexican immigrants, and we were in the east side of the Los Angeles River, which never had any water, and nobody. I mean, it wasn't like living in Los Angeles. It was like living in little countries, and they determined that I had some kind of bronchial condition, some kind of lung condition as a kid, and that I should play a wind instrument, and it would help my lungs. And so my mother asked me what instrument I wanted, and I said, I want the instrument that goes like that. I had seen Tommy Dorsey, so...
but you didn't know the name of it?
I didn't know the name of the instrument, and she didn't know one instrument from another. So she went to the library, and this is actually almost a metaphor for growing up in a Jewish family. She brought me a book without any pictures in it, only words. So I had no way to know. I went through a description of all the instruments in the orchestra, but none of them described what it looked like. So I picked the clarinet, thinking that that name somehow sounded like the thing you would do this with. And when the instrument came, it was not only not a trombone, but it was not even a clarinet, in a sense that anyone would know it was a metal instrument. And I looked at it, and I guess I must have looked disappointed. My mother asked me, and I said, no, this is exactly what I wanted. I was too proud to say I'd made a mistake. So I ended up playing the clarinet, and I guess it must have been within a year. Within 3 years, I was playing concertos. It was just, it was such an amazing experience because I didn't know what everyone was talking about. I mean, someone showed me how to play it, and I played it, and that was it. Like, they gave me music, and I read it. It was this, you know, it was no issue, and it was one of the reasons I finally got involved later with electronics, is because the clarinet just seemed like my thumb or something. It just didn't seem like it was a challenge or anything that was really.
Yeah, I was reading an interview, and it seemed like you didn't really love the clarinet. It seemed like just this thing that you
I may have hated
do really,
it.
really well.
I may have actually hated the clarinet. In fact, I was drafted into the Korean War, into the Army in the early 50s, and I didn't shoot anyone or go anywhere and do anything, but I was drafted into the Army. Just before I went, I have these dreams that because I'd never even touched a gun in my life, and I had these dreams that I was standing up with a gun, and a big bullet, maybe this big, was spinning around and would hit me in my right arm. And as I say it, I could feel the pain in my right arm. It would knock my right arm off. It would hit me in the shoulder, and my arm would fly away. And I'd wake up in this euphoric state. I'd say, gee, I'll never have to play the clarinet again.
And I think this also you when you were in the Army, it also you couldn't salute.
Oh yeah,
was a thing.
yeah. God, where do you learn all that stuff?
It's the internet. It's the internet.
Yeah, I tried not to go in the Army. I actually went to, when I got out of high school, one of the problems with the clarinet was it was very easy for me to do, and I was very, very good, so I could make a living. So I was playing, I got out of high school, and I wasn't going to go to college. I was just going to do music. I was writing music. I was creating music. And I went, got a job with the Denver Symphony Orchestra right out of high school. So I went, and I met Stan Brakhage, I don't know, the filmmaker, and Jim Tenney, and various people who were just getting started also, just out of high school. And oh, no, what was the question? I just lost.
You're being unable to salute.
Oh yeah, so I was going to be drafted into the Army, and I went through this stuff and tried to get out of it. I went to school while I was in the symphony to stay out, but I couldn't stay out of the Army. They finally got me, and I went, and I thought, oh well, I'll figure out a way to get through this thing for 2 years. And the Musicians Union fixed it up so that Herbie Alpert, myself, and a bunch of musicians who were all the same age who were being drafted were going to get into the 6th Army Band, so we wouldn't have to get killed, so the world would have music later in life. Like, I don't know what that was. And I figured I can do it. I can do anything. I'll be in there. And the first thing that happened is I get in there and I realize that I can't shoot a rifle. I mean, it's not that I didn't know how. I passed out every time I pulled the bullet, the trigger. The impact, it was just so foreign to me. The noise, the whole thing. I never managed to hit a target in the whole 8 weeks of basic training. In the second 8 weeks of basic training, I'm walking down, get there. The first day I get to someplace in, I don't know where it was. It wasn't Oklahoma, but it was someplace I'd never been before. And I'm walking, and this general, I don't know what he was, a general, he had things all over him, and he's walking, and I came up to him, and I know you're supposed to stop and salute, but I'd never been face to face with an officer before. And I realized just as in my dream, when the bullet knocked my arm off, I have no right arm, I can't feel it. It wasn't paralyzed, and I've never had an experience like that before or since. It disappeared. I had no right arm, and no part of my brain would make contact with my right arm. And so I just kept walking, and he stopped me, and he said, soldier, he said, how long have you been here? I said, well, I just arrived. And he said, I thought so. He said, well, you know, when you see an officer, what do you do? I said, you salute. Sir, yes, you salute, sir. And he said, okay. He said, dismissed. And so I walk away. I know you're supposed to salute when you leave, but I had no right arm, so I couldn't. And I'd read somewhere if you salute with your left arm, that was something that was very bad. You know, it was like you're making fun of the officer or something. So I didn't try to salute with my left arm. And he stopped me again, and we went through this whole thing, back and forth. He said, salute. I said, I can't. Salute. I can't. And I can't to him meant that I won't. But it went on. Anyway, I don't know how long it was. It seemed like a lifetime. Perspiration pouring down me. I had no right arm. So finally he takes me into the commanding officer of my company, which I was assigned to a band at that point because I was going to play in an Army band. And so I come in, and whatever he was, this officer tells them to put me in jail, to court-martial me, to start court-martial proceedings. Well, I'm 9 weeks in. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in an Army jail. I thought this was not a good idea. And so they look at my records. The guy leaves, and they look at my records. They said, hey, you played in the Denver Symphony. I said, yeah. He said, go get this guy a clarinet and some music. So they brought this music in, and I played it for them. And they said, great. He said, we'll get you out of this a jail thing. If you will volunteer to play all the solos for us for the next 4 weeks, we have all these television shows to do, and the only guy who can play it is sick in the hospital. So can you do that? I said, sure, but you know, I really have this problem. He said, no problem. He said, if you're not in uniform, you don't have to salute. And I said, and he said, and if you're in a formation, you don't have to salute. So you get yourself an apartment off base and get some civilian clothes, come in, change into your uniform, sit down. It'll just be a job. At the end of the day, you get back into your civilian clothes and you go. And so what was interesting about it is that he actually believed me. He didn't ask any questions about it. I don't know if that had ever happened to anyone else, but he believed me. And so I got through that 8 weeks, and then the rest of the time in the Army, every time I saw an officer, I'd hide behind a tree, or if I was driving in a car and the flag was coming down, I'd hide under the dashboard because you had to get out and salute. I spent a year and a half hiding from officers. It was horrible. It's a funny story, but it wasn't funny at the time.
So the Army didn't go so well. It wasn't your thing.
No, it was not my thing. It was really not my thing, no.
After you got out, you went back to Denver?
No, well, I did for a little bit. I was, because I was in the 6th Army Band, that was in the Presidio in San Francisco. And it was, while I was in the Army, it was like a day job, basically. It was not hard. The only hard part was staying away from officers when I was alone. But so and the band was made up of fabulous musicians. Almost all, well, many of them became, Herb Alpert is the one that comes to mind, but many of them became, stayed on. They were all good musicians. And so it was an interesting time from that standpoint. In San Francisco, I got involved with the avant-garde music scene in San Francisco. And so when I got out of the Army, I decided to stay, but I had never studied composition. I had learned music on my own and essentially had, a good education, but it was not a traditional education. So I stayed on. I went back to Denver to finish up a degree, and then one summer, I had a few things that I could do that would give me a degree. And I came back to study with Darius Milhaud, a French composer, at Mills College. They gave me a fellowship to go there, and I stayed on, and that's where I met my friends, Terry Riley and the whole
Before we
group.
get to that, I also remember one story of your first public performance in Aspen.
Well, that was actually when I was working with Darius Milhaud.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was writing avant-garde music at the time, which at that time, avant-garde music was in the 50s, 1956 maybe by then. Avant-garde music was a thing. It wasn't like 100 different things. It was a thing, and I was doing that thing, that avant-garde music. Darius Milhaud had done that thing, but it was a different thing from 1920. So he didn't like my thing, but he liked me. So
he was from France.
Yeah, he was part of Les Six, which was the group that that turned Paris upside down in the 20s.
What was so different about what you were doing compared to what he was doing that he was turned off by it?
They were, he was writing music, it was French music. They wrote music like in 3 different keys at the same time, G and C and F sharp, all at the same time. They did various things, which it was part of the surreal movement, the Dada movement. All of those things were happening in the 20s in Paris, and I was doing post-Webern music, a lot of chromaticism and noise, and I was already starting to experiment with technology and things like that. And the story is, which will also reflect back on Milhaud, is he hated my music, but he loved me, and he loved the fact that I was sort of like him when he was young. And so when I finished my degree, he offered me a fellowship to come to Aspen. At that time I had a child, a wife who was very ill, and a child, and my expenses were huge, and I had no money. So he knew I was working night and day. I was playing with the San Francisco Symphony and everything I could do to make money. And he said, "Why don't you take the summer off and just write music, and we'll give money for you to be able to do that." And so I did, and I was so thrilled and happy, you know, with him. I was conducting also at the time. I was conducting concerts of his music and other people. So I was really absolutely thrilled to have the equivalent of 3 months to do nothing but write music. That was just, I mean, unbelievable. I don't know how old I was, in my 20s, maybe 25, something like that, 26. And the first thing I did was write a piece in the style of Darius Milhaud, a quintet for clarinet and string quartet, and he loved it. And it took me 48 hours to write. I mean, I had great facility to write in almost any style, so I could do that. And he loved it. He put it on a concert in the tent at Aspen, Colorado, and this is a huge festival. Very important one. That and Tanglewood are the two main festivals for all those years in the United States. And at that time, it was practically it, those two festivals. And here I was going to have this piece played in this festival. It would be my first major public performance. And then I started to write my music. And I wrote a piece for four-hand piano, which I thought, without question, was one of the freshest. If anyone heard this piece, they would hear something they'd never heard anything like before. And so I took my quintet off of the concert and put my four-hand piano piece on. And about 2 weeks before the performance, I was rehearsing with the pianists, and I thought, maybe I better tell Mio that I took this quintet off. So I told him, and he was really upset. But I said, Mio, I said, wait until you hear it. I said, you'll love it. You really love it. He said, my dear, I won't love it, but you do it. You do it anyway. So I put the piece on, and I was convinced. There wasn't any question. I mean, I was hearing this piece of music. There was no question that this audience was going to say, my God, I never heard anything like this before. This is fantastic. This is a brand new way of hearing music. And they would stand up and cheer. And I thought, what a way to start my career. Everybody's going to stand up and cheer. So it was in 4 sections. By the end of the second section, there were pauses. There weren't really movements, but there were the empty space there, some silence. People started laughing and making noises. And by the end of the third section, they made so many noises, the pianist had to sit there and stare the audience down to be able to go on to the fourth section. At the end of the fourth section, I was absolutely right. Everybody did get to their feet, but they didn't applaud. They were yelling, screaming. People ran up on the stage and started pounding on the pianos. The woman sitting in front of me said, what, did some kind of a monkey write that piece of music? And I went out ready to spill my lunch. And Mio was in a wheelchair. He'd been in a wheelchair for years, and he was sitting in his wheelchair next to the exit as I was going out. I was in a terrible state. I'd never been in so much pain in my life, except maybe the saluting. I don't know, but it was really awful. It was something so unexpected for me. And I'm going out, and Mio pulled me down so I could see him face to face, and he had tears coming down his cheek. He said, thank you, my dear. It reminds me of the old days. That was my first performance, public performance.
So you get to San Francisco, back to San Francisco, I guess, and you said you were immediately already kind of knowing some people there?
Well, I was in the Army there, so I had, while I was in the Army, I played, and I had, performances, but they were all small performances with the avant-garde, and I met a lot of people at that point while I was in the Army. So when I'm back, I went to study with Mio, and at that time, Pauline Oliveros was studying at the San Francisco Conservatory, and Terry Riley was studying at the San Francisco Conservatory. Ramon Sender was studying at Mills. They don't know Ramon, but he was part of the group. Lamont Young was at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and we were all part of a young group. Mm-hmm. We made concerts together, and we were all close friends.
And you eventually decided to get a space together to pool all of the sort of equipment that you accumulated.
Actually, it was. I was the only one working with technology at the time.
What were you working with?
I was what was I working with? Well, I was working with a de jour tape recorder. It ran. You could set it at 5 different speeds. It wasn't synchronous, so you could never get it to run the same speed. From beginning to end of a tape, it would get faster as you moved, or slower, I guess, as you moved. Whatever happens as you get more tape at the other end, the machine would go slower. So it would go the equivalent to about a whole step lower. It would get so slow. Microphone, and I had taken a Wurlitzer electric piano apart, and basically it was music concreto that I was working with. There was no equipment, but I got for music. I had a garage for a studio, and I got parts from automobiles and trolleys, broken down. Pauline helped me push a piano down a whole flight of stairs until we could break it apart and get only the parts that I wanted out of it, so I could make sound, which I hung in there. So I had a hammer and a couple of other mallets, and I turned the de jour tape recorder on, and I choreographed a move through the room, hitting things as I went, and then would go back. I'd have about 2 minutes of performance that they were called action pieces. So,
it seems like a big step, though, for you guys to buy or rent a space together.
Well, what happened was we were giving concerts. Ramon, Pauline, and I were giving concerts at the San Francisco Conservatory. Stockhausen had just done his first really big tape pieces. The Gazong had just come out, and we were. And also other music, and it was some was technological, some was tape music, but most of it was instrumental music of one sort or another. And we did this for a period of 2 years, and it was called Sonics, was the series. And we gave this concert, which turned out to be our last concert there, but it wasn't intended to be. I had found a tape in an alley, and I sealed it. And it was obviously something that someone had thrown away, and I sealed it. And I was working with the Ann Halpern Dance Company. I have some pictures of some work I did with them here. I could show you some of those. So let's leave time for that.
Sure.
But I was working with the Ann Halpern Dance Company, and the work I did with them was not traditional dance at all. The company, members of the company were going to do, some perfume company had just invented a kit where you could make your own perfume by mixing different odors together. And so the dance company was going to go through the audience and interview people in the audience and decide what kind of smell they should have, and would make the perfume and do that. And so we called this piece, which was the bulk of the evening, I call this piece opera for found tape, smell opera for found tape, with found tape. And I was going to untape, open the case of the tape and play it for the first time in public. We didn't know what was on it. And the group was going to come and give everybody the odor that their personality deserved. And Tony Martin, you'll see some of his imagery. I'll show that to you. Was doing visual projections, and Ramon found an old washing machine, a metal washing machine, and used different kinds of pieces of metal and rocks, and ran the washing machine, which played a percussion thing. And so we put all of this together and did the performance. We also did a tropical fish opera, which I actually have some movies of too, on that concert. And when it was over, the next day the newspapers had a big headline in the art section saying "Concert literally stinks," and the San Francisco Conservatory decided we should never enter the premises again. So that was our last concert, and so Ramon and we were the only two really working with technology. He said, "Well, we can't work here anymore. Why don't we pool our stuff and get a place?" So we did, and we found this house, old Victorian house that was going to be torn down on Russian Hill near Chinatown in San Francisco. And they gave us the entire house to take care of until they were going to tear it down. They didn't know when they would do that. And so we had a free place, and we brought our stuff together, but we knew there was other pieces of equipment in the world than what we had. And
what did you have when you first
well, we
started
had
out?
nothing. We had he had two Hewlett Packard oscillators and my tape recorder and the parts of automobiles. That's all we had. And so Ampex had loaned us some equipment, but that was after we got in there. They loaned us a professional tape recorder. We got the first one that they loaned us. And but we went to this woman who ran the Wells Fargo Bank, and a very, very wealthy woman who had just bought a Stradivarius quartet for a string quartet. And we asked her if she could give us some money to help us develop what we were going to do. And she said, "Sure, but you'll have to become nonprofit." So that's how we got started. So we paid $125 and became a nonprofit corporation. And we didn't know what to call it, but at the time, the European world was divided between musique concrète and electronic music. Cologne had the electronic music, and Paris had the musique concrète, and you couldn't mix the two. It was like oil and water; they wouldn't mix. And Stockhausen, I had met that year, I think. I don't know if it's a true story, but he said that he had to put a microphone in his pocket to take it into the electronic studio because they didn't want microphones in the electronic music studio in Cologne. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he told me. Anyway, we decided not to call it either electronic music or musique concrète. We called it the San Francisco Tape Music Center. Anything you ended up on tape with was music, so that was why it was called that. And called her on the phone, can't remember her name, and said, "Well, now we're nonprofits. Can you send us some money?" So she did. She sent us a check for $25, which we then put on the wall and never got used again. But that's how we pooled our equipment. That was the reason we pooled it.
Tell me about meeting Stockhausen.
Well, I guess
what were the circumstances, first of all?
Well, I'd met him a number of times. I don't know when the first time was, because I was going to festivals and things. And I mean, after all, Stockhausen was just another guy. So, you know, it wasn't like I remember, oh my God, that's Stockhausen. This was just a guy.
Was there someone who was that guy in this circle of early electronic people that you kind of looked up to?
There were none. There was nobody to look up to. We were all struggling to get started. I mean, there were no synthesizers. The studios were, even at that time, I thought the studios were pretty stupid. I mean, the idea of having to cut tape was, I mean, one thing Stockhausen said, it wasn't when I first met him, but he was giving a lecture. He was touring the United States giving lectures. He giving lectures saying that now that we have this electronic music, we won't need musicians anymore. Right, and I remember saying, "Come on, to make go from C to D, you for ta-da, you take ta off a reel of tape, measure it, and then you take the ta and you measure that, and then you lay them over, and so that it doesn't go ta-ta. You want to go ta, you have to make a diagonal cut of 4 inches across the tape, and I said, you can't tell me that's going to replace musicians. So, but that was, you know, there was nobody to look up to at that point. You looked, there was nothing. It was just, it's hard to imagine, but there was just nothing. And it was great. We were making things out of nothing.
At what point did you conceive the idea of, I want some sort of machine that became what the Buchla was? I mean, what was the idea that you wanted to be able to get out of it?
Well, what's up there is the timetable of the period we're talking about. And if you look, you'll see that the transistor, the tape recorder, and the credit card all came into being at the same time, right at the time I'm talking about. This is the time just leading up to the getting of the pooling of the equipment up through the end of the 50s. And I realized that this is before we pooled the equipment. This probably before I met Stockhausen or anyone else, because I think those all were in the 61, 62, 63. So we're talking about the late 50s here, up to 1960. And I was completely aware, as many other people, not a large number of people, but enough, a significant number, were aware that the world was about to change radically because electronics were going to be cheap, and that it was clear that we were moving into a place at a moment in time in history which was the equivalent in music to the printing press with words. And that was startling to me. I thought, my God, what a time to be alive and to be my age, to be getting started at this point. And at that point, I could have stayed on being a musician. I had, you know, no problem with that. I was doing pretty well writing music for instruments. And my music was beginning to be played in spite of those people who booed me at Aspen. And but I thought, and I knew nothing about electronics. I mean, I had this tape recorder. I was experimenting, but I didn't know about electronics. But I knew enough to know what was about to happen. And I thought, I'm going to try to make a piece. If I feel like I have the aptitude with the technology, I'm going to throw the clarinet away finally and not write music for instruments anymore and dedicate myself to this point in history because I'm at a pivotal point. And I didn't think because I can write great music, but I could be part of that change. Who wouldn't like to have been there at the beginning of the printing press and be part of it? But who would like to be the person who said, who needs this and we don't want to do that, you know, and so forth. No, I really felt this was an important thing that I had an opportunity to be a part of.
Where do credit cards come into it?
Well, because, thank you. Because what I was envisioning, the reason it was going to become important was that up until that moment in time, to play music meant you had to learn to read music, you had to learn to take music lessons, you had to have the money to do it. This was an upper class, very stratified thing. Music from the time of Aristotle at least to the time of, we're talking about at this point, what we called music was fine art music, and it was only that for the elite. Not because of any other reason than economics. You couldn't afford, you didn't have the time, and you didn't have the money to train your kid in music. In Italy, it was different because in Italy, they trained orphans to do music from the time of the Renaissance. But most of the world didn't do that. Most of the world, it was part of the aristocratic thing. And so what the printing press did is the same thing happened there. The word was part of the church. It was part of the authority. Once the printing press came, everybody could read. And you started having many religions and many ideas, and it became, the demography of ideas became part, it wasn't there before. And this was going to happen in music, but in order for that to happen, it had to be cheap. And the fact that transistors were very cheap and a credit card meant you didn't even need money. So it was so cheap that it became clear in 1959 that everybody in the world would have an iPhone. Something, you know, and that's the reason the credit card became important. That was the tip-off for me that there was really going to be a change, not just people who knew electronics and so forth, but, I mean, because we were sitting around, a Hewlett-Packard oscillator cost $400 in 1959. $400 is the equivalent to probably $10,000 for one oscillator that did nothing but go, ooh, ooh, you know, and we couldn't even afford that. We happened to be given a Hewlett-Packard oscillator, but we didn't have $400 to buy a Hewlett-Packard oscillator. So suddenly that was all going to change. That was the reason.
Can't imagine what Ableton must have cost back then. At a certain point, you called in engineers. You interviewed them because you had an idea that you wanted to build something, but you didn't know exactly how to build it.
Right. Actually, yes. And that was 1961 or 62, because I'm talking about this period here. So I made a piece that was performed 1961 in San Francisco that had 2 de jour tape recorders, so I could get sound all around the room, 2 2-track tape recorders. I had 4 musicians, I had lighting flats, and a person who spoke. And it was a big multimedia piece that was about 45 minutes long. And when it was over, there was this, unlike my performance a few years before, and maybe only 3 or 4 years before, maybe not even that, in Aspen, the audience went crazy. And the critics called it a new art form has been born, and we repeated it 3 times in 3 weeks. People called me and wanted to tour the thing. It was amazing. So I put it away. I didn't tour with it, but I decided, yes, I must have the aptitude to do this. So I'm going to start. I'm giving up the clarinet as soon as I can afford to do it. I'm not going to write any more instrumental music. I'm going to dedicate myself to whatever this new thing is going to be, or these new things are going to be. And the first thing I said is we've got to get rid of cutting tape. And so we need something. And I was thinking 100 years in the future, which it almost is, well, it's 50 years. 100 years in the future, and what would be the kind of thing that would progress at that point? And I decided what would probably happen is something that I called at the time an electronic music easel. It would be something you'd have in your home that you could make any sound you wanted. You could just paint sound. I mean, like you would paint on a canvas, you would be able to paint sound and create new things. And so I didn't know what that was going to be. The one thing that's really important for me to get across is that I didn't want to make music, I didn't want to go to a new technology and make music that could have been made with a black and white keyboard on a piano. It wasn't just sound. It was an entire new music that would come about. Now, what was going to happen once the demography, I wasn't going to happen as a result of me, but the demography of economics that meant everything was going to be cheap, is that everybody was going to have this. So over a period of time, a new art would evolve by people who didn't study at a conservatory but just liked to work on their own, or maybe people who did different things, and a new art would evolve. And I wanted to be part of it, but the only way I could be part of it is get the object, an object similar to what they were going to be using in 100 years. So I I had this idea of how it would work and what it would do, and not how it was made, and put an ad in the paper once we got the tape center, to invite an engineer to help me to make this.
What did the ad say?
Pardon?
What did the ad say? We want to make the future of music. What did the ad say for the engineer in the paper?
You know, I don't know. I wish I could get a hold of that. I have no idea what it said. Now, you know, who knows? I didn't think I was doing something historic at the time, so I never kept a copy of it. It was an ad in the paper, one ad, you know, paid $20 for a week to have this ad there. So looking for an engineer to make, well, I think I probably called it an electronic music easel because, you know, that easel is a nice metaphor. You know, you can paint music. And 3 guys came by. First one, see, this was 1961 or 2, and the LSD movement, the what did he call that? The psychedelic movement started in 1965. So we were 1964, 65. So this was about 2 years before that. I had no idea that 1/3 of San Francisco was on drugs. I really did not know that, and none of us did. And so the first engineer came, and I thought he had an eye problem because his eyes were looking in 2 directions at the same time, and then he was incoherent. He couldn't talk, so he left. And then a second one came, and he was pretty much the same condition. And I didn't know. I began to figure out what was going on. And then Donald Buchla came, and he was someone that we could really talk to. He was really good.
So the only one not on drugs was the one.
Well, he was probably on drugs. I don't know, but he was coherent anyway. I don't know if he was on drugs, but he was coherent. Not only that, he had already had a similar idea, and so he was completely prepared to move forward on the idea.
It seems like a large break to say we don't want it to have keys. We don't want it to look like what has come before.
Yeah. You know what? Try to put yourself in the position. I'm going to get you some pictures while we're doing this.
You may have kicked the video signal out. I'm not sure.
We lost it, huh?
Yeah.
No, probably need to. Oh, here we go. Is it there? Can we get pictures over here?
Is there someone who can come up that is smarter than I am?
There it is. Okay. Got it. It came out of the plug there.
That's technology.
This is what the Buchla looked like when it first got done. Okay, now remind me where we are now.
It seems like a big break.
Yeah, remember, let me go back to that picture. Remember, we're at a time that I imagined what I was looking at was what I wanted to be involved with wouldn't really come into being for 100 years. So I had no idea what it was going to be. But the notion was that I didn't want to continue the Columbia Princeton, the big RCA synthesizer that had existed, that came in the late 50s. And what they made there was the same old music, but it sounded worse because it went that. And it didn't, no nuance, no anything. The idea, the prevalent idea at the time was, now that we've got the beginnings of computers and this technology, we'll be able to make music better than it was before. We'll be able to play low notes faster, and we can write anything, and that was sort of what Stockhausen was referring to, right? I thought, that's really dumb. I was a fine musician. I could already do that. I remember when it turned 2000, a German keyboard magazine interviewed me and asked me, now in the future, can we make a perfect piano? I said, the piano already is perfect. It does everything it was supposed to do. I mean, it's like, I mean, the whole notion, it seemed to me really, and still does today, odd to think we've got all this new technology, now we can play music again that we could already play. When I did Silver Apples of the Moon on the Moog, they did Switched on Bach. And I thought, and people said, that's electronic music. I said, no, that's Bach played on an electronic instrument. It's not electronic music. It's not a new art form. It's not new, something that the technology demands. So, and I was a trained musician, so I thought the way to go about this is to start without anything. I mean, anything that resembles the tradition. So you get rid of the black and white keyboard immediately, because I don't know what that music is going to be. It's going to, it should come out of the object itself. It should be somehow like the grand piano of Chopin. Liszt and Chopin made music you could never play. It took a while because most of the music on the keyboard was harpsichord music, just played louder and softer. But finally, you find a genre of music. It's not a whole new music, but a genre that fits that piano and nothing else. You couldn't get it any other way. And now we're looking at something much bigger than that. You're looking at a new metaphor for music itself, because you're looking at music that's going to be made by people who didn't necessarily grow up learning music. There's going to be a whole different thing. The first person who hit two sticks together, two stones together, you know, the first person who hummed the same thing one time after another until it caught on and other people hummed it. You know, so that's what I was looking for. So I didn't know what it was going to be. No, in fact, even today, it's hard to imagine that one could imagine what that music would be. And so I did not want a keyboard that would be too easy to go back to the traditional music.
So I think that's a great, probably the greatest lead up to listening to a little bit of Silver Apples of the Moon, to describe what it is that you did with this synthesizer.
Yeah, listen to the very beginning of that. The first thing that you notice is that the is not anything you could have done on a piano. The second thing you notice is that there's little plucks that you could have done. And that was part, the thing when I finally got, this is years later, this is 4 or 5 years later, I realized that I didn't know what it was going to be. You know, even without a keyboard, I was brought back into somehow the musical world, and wasn't exactly like a piano or something else, but it was the boops and beeps from my avant-garde background, you know. So, and I didn't think that was a problem, because people who in the future would not have had my background, so that wouldn't have been the problem. But I wanted to get rid of it, and it took me a while to get to that point. Can you play a little bit of the second side, like go like in the middle? I mean, second side, it's a CD. Second part. A little farther down. Farther in. About halfway in. That's it. louder. That was totally forbidden
Why?
at that time because you tapped your foot to it, you liked it, it made you move. This was, we didn't have hip hop yet. There was nothing there. There was rock and roll, but this isn't really rock and roll. And the fine art world was devastated by this. I have to tell you, 1966, this came out in 67, but started on it in 66. Started on it as the beginning of, I was helping to create the Electric Circus, which was a big discotheque in New York, upstairs from the Andy Warhol Velvet Underground. And I was really dedicated to the idea of the demographic equalization of things, that everybody could get their hands on it. And so I was working in creating the beginnings of discotheques, a multimedia discotheque, and the opening of the Electric Circus was coming up. So I was working on the music for it. That was what this was originally, before I started making Silver Apples of the Moon. I was already working on that as part of the opening for the discotheque. Started with a heartbeat, and it was a fancy occasion because everybody was in tuxedos. They had Seiji Ozawa from the Boston Symphony, the Kennedy family were all there. It was a big thing because the people who had the money for the Electric Circus had brought all these people down to make a big deal. And we started in the dark with a heartbeat that ran at the tempo of this, that was thumping with the subwoofer. Buchla designed the electronics for the place. The subwoofer was attached to the floor of the dance hall, so the whole floor shook, literally shook. Vibrated. It was part of the sound. You were inside the speaker, so to speak, and we had all light bulbs were controlled by the Buchla synthesizer, and so you had this had not been done before, so people had tried it, but not in any kind of public situations. The beginnings of strobe lights and things like that. So you get these small flashes with a heartbeat. We had people who were who walked on tightrope, from circuses, dressed in white and black light so that they would shine blue as they walked across. One was eating a banana as he walked across. But he would just appear every once in a while, different places in space as this thing built. And it kept building and building and building until you get to this music. You can play a little bit of it again right there. So you get moving through this until it reaches this frenzy. And lo and behold, when the lights got big enough, you could see that actually everybody was dancing to it, which never occurred to me anyone would do. I was thinking of this frenzy, sort of primitive experience with technology of growing to this thing. I had no idea people would actually move to it, so they were all dancing to it. Now I lost the question. You probably lost it too.
But
yeah.
I guess I was going to ask you why you decided to move to New York from San Francisco, but I guess given the chance to have this...
San Francisco was great. I loved San Francisco, and I thought I could stay there my whole life. The things we were doing had... we were a major avant-garde entity in San Francisco. I had, by the time I was 30 years old, I was really well known in San Francisco, and I was offered an opportunity. I still didn't know what I was doing. In fact, I don't think I still do. I think I'm getting there, but I knew I wanted to be part of this thing, and I was still concerned about my aptitude to be able to deal with this. I knew I had some aptitude for it, but I didn't know how far I could go with this thing. And I began to feel like the clarinet, like when I was a kid. I'd play, you know, The Flight of the Bumblebee all staccato at 11 years old, you know, and people would go, "Oh my God, you got to go and put them on the radio. This is incredible." And I thought, you know, I don't get it. And so I wasn't sure, because I was looking 100 years down the line. I wasn't sure where this was going and whether I wanted to stay with it if I could, but I didn't know if it was meaningful enough. And San Francisco became like my mother. You know, my mother would say, "Oh, you're so smart, but you're my mother. Of course I'm smart." You know, San Francisco was like a small town, and we were really great in San Francisco. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to really have an impact. I wanted to do something or not do it, you know. And and so I was offered an opportunity to go to New York to be artist in residence at the new School of the Arts at NYU. And that was going to give me enough money to live on. I could give up the clarinet. And I thought, I didn't go to New York for any other reason, except that I thought to myself, this is the chance for me to really find out, because this is big time stuff. New York, is, we all know, is just, you know, it's like a city that is so tight, so public oriented, so everything generates from that place, that if I feel I'm really doing something in New York that makes sense, then I'll stay with it. If not, I'm going to go to Lawrence, Kansas. It's a little town in the middle of the United States, and be a school teacher, because I knew I could talk and lecture, and forget about trying to do something if I'm not capable of doing it, you know. So I was there for a year when Silver Apples of the Moon came out, and I suddenly was on the top of the charts and a public figure, and I thought, damn, I'll never get to Lawrence, Kansas.
Were you pretty surprised that it made a dent in the charts?
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, looking in hindsight, it makes sense. But at that moment, we're still talking about, you know...
I don't think it makes a ton of sense.
Pardon?
I don't think it makes a ton of sense.
Well, it does, because I was right. The world was moving toward a new paradigm. That technology, the record player, was taking the place of the piano in the home to hear music with. This is all things that I predicted back in 1961. And this was this machine that was not supposed to be bought by anyone, but it was a model for what the world would be like in the future. It was going to be a world in which people would walk around with buds in their ears. I didn't think of that particularly, but it would be personal, and everybody could be doing it. And so the fact that I made music that was electronic and that was visceral, it wasn't heady music, it was music that I really felt got to me, it got to these other people as well. It was a kind of music that I could pick off a record thing. I'd like to listen to that. Most of the music you were listening to at that time was so that you can go to a concert and understand it. But you know, this was visceral music. And the fact that it was electronic, the fact that everybody was beginning to... The reason Switched On Bach was so good, I mean, they bought more Switched On Bach than they bought Bach, because it was switched on. That was the moment. And I happened to hit that moment, but I had no idea I was going to hit that moment.
What doors opened up after this sort of became a more mainstream, so to speak, thing, that it hit the charts?
Well, the synth became mainstream, but not the synth, not this synth, the Moog, because Bob, before he died, I knew him quite well, but before he died, we had spent some time together. We were doing lectures on panels together and things, and we were both going through the history, and I said, well, Bob probably built, I didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world. Bob probably built a synthesizer, even before we did. And he said, no. He said, you guys did the very first one, as far as I know. He said, I had a couple of modules, and I was getting ready. Someone said, why don't you build a synthesizer? Look, they did this over here. And that wasn't called a synthesizer, but, a whole system, And he said, and I looked at your system, and I loved the idea of the touch plate keyboards and everything. He said, but all my music, he didn't know anything about music. He said, all my musical advisors tell me I have to use a black and white keyboard. And I said, yeah, nobody would know the name Moog if you hadn't to that. Because what happened from that point on is exactly what I was trying to avoid, is that everybody started making music, but with the same old music, but with electronics. Some of it was a little new music, but it wasn't a different music with a keyboard. And that caught on. That was, in terms of mass media, that's what really took off. Synthesizers took off, but it was not my concept of the synthesizer. So my world, the world I saw 100 years in the future, as far as I can tell, is just barely beginning right now in terms of the demography. I'm seeing it. I've been traveling a lot, going to concerts and festivals, being brought to perform. And I'm seeing a lot more people who really understand what I'm talking about. Are beginning to anyway. And seeing that there is another world out there that has not been explored. And that world isn't out there. That world is in here that we have to find for ourselves. But it's not easy. It's a hard one to discover what you would do if you didn't have a black and white keyboard. It's like going without it, traveling in a new city without an iPod, without an iPhone.
It seems strange, though, that this had some popular success. If people hadn't caught on to what you were doing.
You mean like being on the top of the charts?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the top of the charts, yes, it's true. That I can't figure out to this day. But the top of the charts, when it came out, it hit the top of the charts almost immediately. And within the first month, it was at the top of the classical music charts, not the pop charts. And so it was on the top of the classical music charts. And I thought, my God, I at that point was going a lot into Washington, D.C., but a 90-minute drive or train ride. And I thought, God, maybe at the end of this year I can buy an automobile. I'm on the top of the chart. So I got my first royalty check, and it was for $2,000, which even in those days wasn't going to, it could probably have bought me a car, but that's about it. I couldn't have afforded the gas to go. And I thought, that can't be right. I was on top of the charts this whole time. I found out that with popular music, even then, I'm talking 1967 at that point, popular music, it was on the basis of how many records were sold per week or month or whatever it was that the charts went up. In classical music, it was how many reorders in 5 record stores across the United States. And the original order was for 3. Right? They would get 3 in there, and when the 3 went, they'd reorder them. So I had the most reordered of any classical, including the Boston Pops and all of that stuff. It amounted to 10,000 records, which was huge by classical music. Even years later, the most the Boston Pops sold was like 4,000 or something like that in a year. So this was huge from that, but nothing like the millions of records that were going on. So when you talk about, popular success, it wasn't really popular success. It was headlines, but it wasn't popular success in the same sense. A switched on box sold 40,000 or 50,000.
None Such seems like a strange label to have invested in this. At the time, they were sort of a budget record label, and they'd never done
Yeah.
anything like this, correct?
Did you read the story?
No.
Oh, well, that's good. Then I can tell you something you don't know. Here, I'll show you this is my studio in, there. That's my studio on Bleecker Street.
And this is where you recorded Silver Apples.
I didn't record Silver Apples. I created it in the computer, with the computer and all this stuff. It wasn't recorded, done and then recorded. So it's where it was created, yeah, technologically. This is a studio there. So you see the Bleecker Street Cinema, and you see the doorway there. And you would go up a flight of stairs, and we were right above the Bleecker Street Cinema is where my studio was. And down the street, if you look at the Bleecker Street Cinema sign and you go straight down, the white building behind it is the what was it called? The Village Gate, where all the rock bands were playing. And so I worked all night long, and 2 o'clock in the morning, when the band stopped, members of bands, Grateful Dead, Mothers of Invention, would pop into my studio. People from Andy Warhol's group would pop in after what they were doing. They would just sit around. I had a couple of sofas. They would sit around and just talking and watching me. The word had gotten out that there was this mad scientist with wires making crazy sounds. So they would come in and rarely had a real conversation, but they would come in. And in the meantime, I'd been, as I said, from 1961 forward, for the 5-6 years leading up to that, I was doing public lectures talking about this new thing that was going to happen, and that the record player would become take the place of the piano as chamber music for the large percentage of people in the world, and the record companies would eventually see, and people would eventually say, it's immoral and unethical to take a Beethoven string quartet that was intended to be played by 4 people in front of an audience and record it and replace them and that experience with a record, that the record, in fact, will become a new medium, and that people will make music specially for the record, and that all other recordings would be left to the 78 category, which would be a black and white snapshot, where you would have to every 3 minutes turn it over to get the rest of the piece, because you were only studying the music or remembering the music as it really was meant to be. And of course, I never believed that would happen, and it, in fact, really didn't happen. I mean, it only happened for a moment, but we're still not at that. We may get to that point at some point, but we're not there now. And so in the middle of all of this, I'm working, and these guys are all sitting around. In that, where that those buttons are, there's a door, and the door was never locked because it didn't have a lock. And you go up the stairs, and there was a big notice there that said, "Beware, you're being watched." It was a camera, but it had nothing inside of it. That was the only thing we had to keep people from coming and stealing anything in any of the studios there. And so, in walks this guy around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, dressed in a suit, and he says, "I'm the president of None Such Records," and he gives me my speech to me. He says, and we think this is blah, 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 unethical, and we're almost word for word. And he said, and we've met today, and we have $500 put aside if you will make the first one. And so I kicked him out because I thought he was making fun of me. And first of all, I never heard of None Such Records. It sounded like an unlikely name for a record company. And I just didn't like being made fun of, so I kicked him out. I get home, and it turns out that I had None Such Records, but I didn't think of it as None Such because they cost 80 cents. And I used them in the morning. I got my kids off to school, and before they got up, I would listen to a particular Brandenburg concerto on None Such Records. And I thought, oh my God, this is a real record company. So I tried calling all day long, and they didn't have a phone number. They were part of Electro Asylum, but I didn't know that. And the next morning, I mean, middle of the night, same thing, different people, but the same thing. The guy comes in again. And this time I'm going to go on my knees and say, I'll do it for nothing. And he says, don't come near me. He thought I was going to hit him or something, I guess. He said, no, just listen to me. He said, just stay there and listen to me. He said, we met again today and we've upped the ante. We'll offer you $1,000. And I said, I'll take it. And that became Silver Apples of the Moon.
So he thought it was just a negotiating tactic more than anything else.
He thought it was. I had enough for me. I was just...
Silver Apples and the Wild Bull are both have an influence, I guess, of poetry. There's a Sumerian poem, The Wild Bull.
The Wild Bull was a Sumerian poem, yeah.
What? How does that influence the stuff that you make?
It didn't.
Not at all.
Well, the Wild Bull did to some extent, but only in a. I mean, you have a name for a piece, right? And there was the sense. What I got from the Silver Apples. I was just looking for a name. I really didn't have any. I thought. I mean, I had become quite literate over the years, because when I went to college in Denver to stay out of the Army, I majored in English literature and ended up, because I already knew music, I was playing professionally, and I had not done any reading at all in any outside of music. So I became really quite literate, and I had poets for friends and so forth. So I knew literature very well, and so I remembered the Yeats, and it seemed to me that the opening does sound like Silver Apples, you know, of the Silver Apples of the Moon. So I gave it that name. You needed a name. That was the thing. The Wild Bull was a little different in that the woman, it's a beautiful poem, unbelievable. When you consider that writing started in Sumeria, at least the earliest writing we know about was in Sumeria about 7,000 years ago, and so this is at the seat of what words can do. This is what I felt, you know, and Sumeria was sort of the seat of what happens, the poetry that could happen as a result of language being written, the written language, let alone later the printing press, but this is before that, and. So here you have, because I felt I was doing something, not that my work was similar, but I was engaged in something similar in terms of historic change, that we now have technology we can make music with. Now they had words they could manipulate because they were being written, you just didn't speak them. And the poem is about this woman whose husband goes off and doesn't come back to war, and he doesn't come back. And so, and I had this thing about trying to make the record, the form of the record was side one and side two. So side one is the female side, and side two is the male side. This is the music through his body, and the other one is through her body. So that, in that sense, it was influenced, but it doesn't tell a story of any sort.
Let's just listen briefly to a little snippet of that.
Listen to the very opening. That's the sound of my baby son at the time, slowed down 100 times and manipulated. And because I was at the Electric Circus, we'll go on and listen to it a little bit more. Because I was at the Electric Circus, we were doing multimedia avant-garde concerts on Monday nights. The rest of it was dancing, and became very well known at the time. Salvatore Martirano and I don't know if you know him, but he did a synthesizer called the Salmar later. And he and I were very good friends, and we were invited to do a concert of our music at someplace in Massachusetts. And the woman who organized it said Sal Martirano and Morton Subotnick from the Electric Circus. So they all thought this was rock and roll. And we had 4 concerts sold out before we got there. And when I found out about it, there were bumper stickers and everything going. I said to the woman, I said, "You've made a terrible mistake. They're going to think we're rock and roll." No, they all know what you do. It's just fine. So the concert starts with these 2 sounds, and because we did the Wild Bull semi-live, some of it was live, some of it was recorded, and there was a guy on the stage who's smiling. He begins to smile with black light on his teeth, so he's standing there, sort of a shadow, and then gradually, after the first one, you see this strange smile, these teeth, in the silence, and I think there's a third one, and then people started yelling all kinds of insults, and people ran out to get their money back. That's all I can remember about this. Now we're going to the third one, I think. Imagine this much silence at a rock and roll concert. The high one is all made, talking about black and white keyboards, it's all made from a touch plate keyboard controlling various things, including pitch. So you go dee, dee, and you certainly could not do that on a piano. I don't think you could do it on a violin. You could make the pitches, but you couldn't get that quality.
How long did it take you to get the hang of the instrument? I mean, well, that you felt like I can get exactly what I want out of this.
No,
or have you gotten the hang of it?
Yeah, but first of all, Don and I worked for well over a year before there was any equipment, because we needed $500, which we didn't have. So we did it all on paper. And by the end of that year, when he started to work, I already knew, I had conceptualized the logistics of most of what the modules were going to do. And I'd even imagined doing what I just did, but didn't have the equipment to do. So the first 2 or 3 years of the synthesizer was actually knowing that I could do it and practicing until it actually happened. It was really the sequencer that started to bring in, the sequencer was originally designed to be able to make long takes at something, because I could take, you had 3 voltages coming out per stage, and there were 8 and 16 position sequencers, and I would take them and gang them, so I would have one that went 16, one that would go 15, and one that would go maybe 7. And then that would mean I had 9 voltages from each, if you take all the voltages out. And the 9 voltages would be mixed in different ways. Pairs of them would be mixed. So that if you have a voltage of 2 and another one of 0.5, you have 2.5. But they don't come back to the same exact configuration for 15 times 16 times 7 times. So you get this long, long sequence, and you spend weeks tuning until you get what all the parameters of movement in space and everything that you want on it, until you get exactly what you want. You're performing over periods of 2 to 3 weeks, listening and fine-tuning, sculpting. And so it was the experience of working with that sequencer, which I had imagined ahead of time, but I didn't realize how absolutely engrossing it was to be able to do that. And then when you could do that, so the reason I used a smaller one, a 7, because that would then be part of the rhythmic structure, where the other ones would be controlling timbre and other kinds of things. The rhythmic structure was always on a smaller bass, and the actual rhythm was altered because the space between 1 and 2 would be altered slightly by a voltage from another place. So this would go da-dum, dee-dum, dong, dee-dum, dee-ding, dong, da-dum, dong, da-dum, dee-dum, dong. So you would get this smaller group that you could recognize, but it was changing slightly, or you could not change it. You could take parts of it and have it always do the same thing. That's what you're hearing at Silver Apples and things.
You used the word sculpting just now, and that seems to be the word that you use to describe what you do quite a bit. Why is that the one that's sort of stuck with you as accurately describing it?
Because painting is 2-dimensional, and sculpting is 3-dimensional, and music is 4-dimensional. So the only thing that music adds, what I say on my last, I think my next to the last record jacket, was that's where I actually write this whole thing down about sculpting and time. I say I feel like I'm sculpting, I'm a painter sculpting in a canvas of time and space, sculpting sound in a canvas of time and space, because I considered, even from the very beginning, the spatial element was not an adjective, but really a noun. I mean, it really is. It tells you something directly, like a pitch does. So if it's a sound, you'll hear in some of the music. I can play a couple of examples of that. Rather than, I'll sing it. Oh, maybe I don't have it here. Oh yeah, I do. Oh, it's on a different one. Wait a minute. It's on this one. Oh. Here, it's down here somewhere. Here. I'll play this one for you. This is the one I'm talking about, where I finally got to this point where I would use a microphone, and I would record my voice and then use the envelope of my voice rather than an envelope generator, finally. And but I was dealing with this sculptural space in which I could go and the energy would be the way in which the sound would move in space and change. And
this is from 1975?
1975, yeah. Well, I don't hear anything. Wait a minute. Do I not have sound here? Yeah, there you go. Let's go back. Bring it up pretty high.
Yep. You may have to turn yours up as well.
Really loud. I'm as loud as I can get here, I think. Yeah, that's the excerpt. What I did is I sang just now for you what I sang in my studio, and you're not hearing my voice up there. You're hearing the Buchla synthesizer, but with the energy and shape of my voice. So I could make a coherent performance of a minute, 2 minutes long, and then cut it up into little pieces with leader in between, and then sculpt, sitting there for a long time, just listening instead of a sequencer, hearing the result of my voice, and mold it until I get, and then I go, I cut the first one out, and you get the, and then that's a week's work, and then that's 2 days' work, and then and so forth. Then you take the leader out, and you get a coherent performance from beginning to end, because I had already made it it's like sketching and then filling it in. So it has a very strong procedural, not end result, but a procedural result. I think of it as studio art. The composer became a studio artist. That it doesn't mean anything anymore, because everybody's a studio artist now, but that you needed to write the music down so someone else could play it and then put it out on an audience for someone to hear it, whereas the painter and the sculptor were sitting there with it, experiencing it, making the changes, and being the first viewer, and that's what I was able to do in my studio.
Until Spring seems like a record that was kind of a breakthrough for you, that you were finally able to do something that you hadn't been able to do before.
Yeah. By the time I got to Until Spring, by the time I got to this, I felt this is clearly not music from the tradition, whereas both the Wild Bull and Silver Apples were. They have many traditional elements to them, melodies and so forth. I came to play you a little bit of this. This is the dance from A Sky of Cloudless Sulphur, which was the final work of this group this is with visuals from Sue Costable. It's on my new DVD coming out. And this uses pulsing, and some of the energy shapes that I do with my voice. And this was 1976, I think. But this is a new version. In fact, I'll be performing parts of this tomorrow night. I end with this. And using the pulsing as I described, but now using one single chord that covers an entire range, and placing different pitches of that chord, so they form. It's as if you had a string instrument and you never change the pitch of any of the strings, but you can play lots of little tunes within that range, so it's all constantly going. And this is what that sounds like. Here. That uses the little rhythms in it were the things I described, where they sound like they're the same, but they're not exactly the same. But it's close enough. There are slight variations of them coming from the single sequencer, which is all being pulsed. And the overall pulse is like a click track. It is a click track, but it's on the top. By this time, I had been given a 16-track tape recorder from Columbia, so I was able to really, I put a click track on top. But the click track was made from my tongue. It's my tongue is going and a loop from that. So it's you hear some slight. It's as if I can do it now with the Buchla, and tomorrow night I'll be doing some of that where I can actually introduce that to a straight pulsing, so I don't have to use my tongue for 45 minutes. But what you get from a straight pulsing is this constant machine click. But you get a kind of random change of velocity, which makes not a machine. And when you hear it, you hear slight dropouts you feel like you can put your hand through the pulse at some point because there are actually little holes in it. And I now do that live. I can actually do that without my tongue by building voltages on velocity for the pulse so that they vary from 100% to 90% to 70% back up, and then offsetting them, or putting a random voltage on one and offsetting them with another one so that they add two different things that never quite ever come back. And they sound the same, but you do have a kind of live human feeling to it.
Has your voice been a source for your music for a long time now? You keep talking about using your voice. This sort of has that been a source for your music for a long time?
Because remember 100 years ago when I was talking about 1961, and I said, when the first time you ever hit two rocks together, I finally got around 1971, 72. I was really here. I was hitting the charts. Wild Bull hit the top of the charts too. I was hitting the top of the charts. In fact, we're in Spain, right? I was in Spain the summer after Silver Apples of the Moon, pondering this whole issue. Someone had given me a house in Mijas, and I stayed there for almost 4 months and trying to deal with this thing. Here I was, top of the charts, and I felt like I could write an orchestra piece that was like Silver Apples of the Moon. And in fact, that summer I wrote an orchestra piece. Now we're getting my family. That's okay. It wasn't until 1975, 1976 that it finally came to a head. But 1971, I realized what's missing is that I'm not getting back to the first rock, the hitting of two rocks together. And for me, that was it was me, inside me, what that was. And it wasn't rocks, it was my voice. So I began to use my voice, and I called Buchla in 1969, I think it was, and I said, Don, I need something that will translate my vocal sound into straight voltage. And that's the beginning of, as far as I know, the first envelope follower that came. There may have been some around, I don't know, but I didn't know about them, if there are. I still don't know about them, if there were. For me, it was certainly the first, and began to play with that, and gradually each piece got more and more together until I really had it down as an art form.
The last thing I wanted to touch on before opening up to questions is video. Sue Constable did this thing for your DVD, and tomorrow night you're going to be working with Lilivan. I saw you two play in Poland, and I was struck at Unsound just recently.
Oh, the recent one.
Yeah, and I was struck by the fact that you weren't facing the audience when you played. You were facing the screen, the visuals.
Yeah.
And I guess that's partly to show off this amazing instrument.
I wasn't facing the screen because I was looking at the screen. I was facing the screen because I wanted the Buchla to be seen, that it was actually
so you were just
something was playing. Well, I mean, it wasn't just turning something on and having it go, that I was actually playing it.
Right.
And I think that's important, and at least at this stage in the game. given laptops and things like that. That I do use Ableton, but Ableton, the Buchla goes to the Ableton and everything, so that an oscillator gets duplicated 5-6 times, and I can do different things with that oscillator. Instead of having 5 oscillators, I have 3 oscillators, and each one multiplies. So I have a really great setup with it. But I'm still using some samples, but more and more it's all getting to be live.
Okay, then to go back to the visuals very briefly then, I guess why Lillivand, and what is that collaborative process?
Well,
like
I
for
started as I described in 1961. I used visuals way back in 1961 as part of the first performance, because I had 2 visions, or that's too large. I had 2 thoughts about the future. One was the recording as a medium, and the recording was to me pure music, something you listen to, you take it in, and you do it as personal. You do it in each individual is personal, even in an audience, but you do it, now, of course, with pods in your ears and in your living room and so forth. The other is what happens to the public performance. The public performance and the recording should be, like studio art, should be perfect for you when it comes out, and so that when you give it to someone else, it's guaranteed that the person who gave it to you really likes it. That was my feeling, that this is as good as it could be for them before they give it to you to listen to it forever in your living room. What is the live performance then? It's the opposite. Live performance is, this is the moment. And it has to be a moment that is, if it could fail. And that moment should be, to some extent, have a kind of drama to it, a theatrical. And I also felt from the beginning that the dimensions of music on a record are 4 dimensions. You've got spatial dimension, was more because you have timbre and maybe 6 or 7 dimensions in it. But they're all in the world of sound. But a live performance is not. A live performance is in the world of being with other people. It's in the world of doing what I'm doing with my hand right now, which wouldn't be there if you were listening to a radio. And it means something. It means something that I lean my face forward as I said that. I didn't intend to, but it has a different meaning than I said it means something. It means something is different. And so for me, the live performance has to have a visual component. And if you're performing on a musical instrument, it does. You see the performer playing. But with electronics, you don't see the kinetic response, because I imagined that what I could get with a computer was like I have an entire orchestra I've trained that's at my beck and call, and I don't play every note. I mold the orchestra like a conductor does. So I'm making decisions all the time. I'm being a composer, and I'm performing in the sense it's spontaneous, that this is going to come now this way. I have files that I could play very, very soft, and they would mean one kind of thing. I have positions where, and so forth and so on. I don't need to go into the details of that. So I felt from the very beginning that if we could have a kinetic visual component, which is a parallel piece, somebody I improvise with when I'm doing this stuff, who knows the music and is willing to listen to the way I do it differently each time and go with it, that they have a visual kinetic vocabulary that is the counterpart to my sticking my chin out or something like that. So that's been there from 1961. I worked with Tony Martin for a long time. I still do occasionally. And I found Lillivand because he was brought in when they were doing, when I was commissioned to bring my opera, finish my opera, and he did the visuals, because the idea of all of this was to not recreate, but produce the real work from 1961. And I finally did that with Jacob's Room, which got played in Bregenz, Austrian, and Dresden, Berlin, and Vienna last year. It'll be at the Warsaw Autumn in September. and Little Van did the live video with it. That's how we met, and then we began working together.
What is it about his visuals that appeals to you so much?
Well, the visuals are it wasn't so much the content of the visuals, though I like them very much. I think they're great, but it's the way he works, which is making kinetic decisions on the same basis that I make musical decisions, that, you know, we're dealing with something that is increasing in energy, that is fast, slow, that you'll see that, for instance, the Sue Costabile, she's using bars that fluctuate. I like her work very much, but this isn't what I have quite in mind, because this is sort of what I did at the Electric Circus, where you pulse something to the music. He interprets the kinetic energy of the music into a kinetic visual energy, and it's parallel. It's not direct. And that's what I was really looking for. I like what Sue does, so I'm happy to work with her. But I've always tried to get her to do a little more complex, you know. And now she does. Actually, we did a performance in New York together, and she's expanded that vocabulary quite a bit. It's closer to what Little Van does at this point. But hers looks different than his.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's open it up to questions from the audience. If you could just wait for a microphone, that would be wonderful.
Hi. I'm interested in what you said earlier about, you talked about a primitive experience with technology. And I was wondering, what does that mean to you? And how do you join those two worlds? I mean, the primitive and the electronic world. And what are the differences between the two of them?
Let me take just the first part of that. Now, you meant, what I meant by primitive, say that, just that first part again, the question.
You said primitive experience with technology.
Yeah, I don't remember saying that, but I'm sure I did. I think it depends on where I was and when I was saying that, but there are two forms of the primitive experience. But I think the kind of the experience, the primal experience, but I think primitive is probably not the right word. It's a primal experience. It's something that you're starting from scratch. It's very hard to do. We just have too much. Nobody can really do it. But eventually, you know, getting to, well, let's see. If you think about, if you think about the way people sing "Happy Birthday" together, they all go up and down together, but they don't sing the same notes. But the shape of it is the same. The primitive, or the thing is, it's that gesture and shape. It doesn't matter about the particular, whether you do it on C or D or E. And basically we understand that as human beings, as animals, we understand that. But we give it up in music to be, unless you sing the right notes, you're not musical, right? And so I'm trying to avoid, that's the keyboard thing. I'm trying to avoid when I go down, you know, if it goes from C to G or C to A or C sharp, or it's going up and it's got a register, and this is the way I'd like it to sound without worrying about what the pitches are. Now, my ears are trained in such a way that they do end up to be C to G, but not because I meant them to be. Whereas with a keyboard, you're stuck with whatever tuning you've got at that point. So getting to the gesture, getting to the inside, and finding a way to express it. That's what I think I meant by the primitive. And then what was the other part of the question?
I'm going to ask you another question. I'm going to change. What does silence mean to you? Does it have an important part in the music you create?
Not in the way silence, you said, right? Not in the way it means in John Cage. He means it in a very different, I think, he meant it in a different way. We actually never had that conversation, but I always assumed we meant for it different. Silence to me is part of the fabric of, for instance, if you ask the question, how long does a note last? You're actually saying, when does a note begin and when does it end? But if you say, what is the rhythm, what is the timing of that note? Ta, ta, ta. It's a quarter note, but not a quarter note long. It starts and there's silence in between. And so the silence in between is the designator of the anticipation of the next sound. And if there is no next sound, it's over. So if you don't, so you go duck, duck, duck. Oh. So it's part of, it's a dimension of time, of sound in time. The lack of sound. Because if I go da, 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 that's different than dot, dot, dot. And you're working with silence. But that's not what John, I don't think he was talking about that aspect. He's talking more about the timbre and the world of sound. I'm talking about the musical silence when I'm dealing with it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
You used silence quite dramatically in The Wild Bull, for example.
Yes, very, very, and there you have no pulse. So there it's a matter of personal intention of the question I asked myself at the time, how loud can I go before I give up? Listening. And that's how long those silences are. I'm a little more restless than most people, so they don't take too long. And we had a question over here.
Hi, I had a question further regarding your music and visual representation. I watch a lot of horror movies, and when I'm listening to the soundtracks, I hear a lot of borrowed textures and moods from some of your music. Especially in the first piece we heard Silver Apples, a lot of the prickly stuff. And I was wondering, did you ever think when you were making these pieces that you wanted to create a sense of unease in the listener as those textures are used in a horror movie? And how do you feel about those kind of similar textures and moods being used to create that sense of unease?
No, the answer is no. I did not think that. I didn't actually, I wasn't aware that something in horror movies sounds like my music, and it may not.
There's definitely similar, like they definitely borrow from you,
Yeah, it could be. I know I used to get letters from people in the late 60s that they saw strange green creatures coming into their bedroom and they listened to Silver Apples. Did I have that in mind? And I would answer the question with no, I didn't have that in mind. I mean, I don't mind. The rest of it is I have no problem with it being used however it's going to be used. And as a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, there was a very wealthy man in New York who was very proud of the fact that he played Silver Apples with the Moon every Halloween out of his house so that he would scare people. And at one point, within the first year or so of its coming into being, Macy's used it at a Halloween display, and so it must have had that effect on people. But I never had that effect. I mean, and I didn't intend it, but it doesn't have it doesn't have a message. Jean-Paul Sartre said once in an essay that music doesn't mean anything; it's meaningful. And so you draw meanings out of the meaningfulness, and everybody does it differently. So that's one of the nice things about it.
Thank you.
I'm actually also interested more in the technologic part of the book.
In the what?
In the more technologic part, like the controlling part, which was a big deal, I guess, to lose the black and white keyboard and the solutions found for it and stuff. And I was actually interested also in how do you see nowadays technologies as such for controlling, for example, the Buchla, your Buchla. How do you see opportunities in that? And are you using newer technologies also than the touch responsive?
No, I'm using I'm using my voice through the envelope followers, and I'm using his touch plate keyboards. But they're all designed. They're better now, but they're designed from the 1962 to 63 period. So I'm very used to them. And the reason I use the touch, because we have so much control. Our fingertips are very much an extension of our emotion. We can do lots of things with them, and our voice too. You can't do as much with your nose, your toes. And I experimented with a lot. I use things in space, but you really, unless you could get down to, even if you did something very gentle like that with your hand, it's really coming at your fingertip when you can touch something that you get the real extension. So I think, and I have a picture somewhere on my website with I have a sensor on my glasses, and that's a heat sensor measuring the heat when I close my eyes. When anyone closes their eyes, there's less heat than the reflection of light off the white of your eyeball. So I could actually measure the relative movement of and use that as a controller at one point. But none of it has the kind of control that you can get, I can get anyway, with my voice and with my fingertips. So it's not like it's wide open. You can put sensors on your body and have your brain do it, but I can't control my brain, and I could have your heart rate do it, but I don't want to have the heart rate go as fast as I can use my tongue. And so it depends on what you want to do with it. But for what I want to do, I want it to be an extension, just like I was answering her, of a kind of ur quality from inside the music that would come, the energy behind the music, and then turn it into sound from that. And so far, the only two things I've found that are meaningful are the finger pressure and placement of the finger, which a black and white keyboard doesn't do, and my voice.
Thank you.
Hello. I was just curious if, like, coming from San Francisco, where everyone's high and kind of lazy and casual, to going to New York, where it's a little more aggressive, how your music changed? Or did it influence it?
Probably. I didn't intend it to, but it probably did. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know. I sometimes think about that. What would have happened had I stayed in San Francisco, and what would have happened had I had been a flop and I went to Lawrence, Kansas? I probably wouldn't be here right now.
Yeah. Is there any new music that you're excited by? Recent music?
My recent music?
No, just other people. Is there anything that you like that's kind of modern that you're into?
Oh, to listen to, you mean?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's asked a lot, and I have to say, I don't think of it that way, so I don't categorize them. I categorize things after the fact. One thing I've learned is that I can't judge what I'm hearing for the first time. If I don't like it, I'm destined to go back and listen more, and don't like it more or like it less or like it more. But I can tell you that some of the more recent music that I came to like very much was Messiaen. The music that sort of I developed my aesthetic that I discovered I didn't know I had one, but I had an aesthetic. I have an aesthetic, and I called it early on. In the late '60s, I began to give it a name, and it's the ecstatic moment. So music that has that tends to attract me more.
Can I ask a quick question? Hi, I'm here. you're gonna play tomorrow live set. I really want to know how your live performance is gonna be. What do you use? Is it gonna be a prepared set, or you're gonna do like freestyle things? See how it going.
It's combination. I'm using the Buchla live, and I'm moving it through Ableton. I have samples. Everything is spontaneous in the decisions of when, what happens, and how it happens. But I have a set of resources, both in the patch with the analog synthesizer and in the computer. It's limited to what I've got in there that I've chosen for this performance. And some of it are samples, so although I can change both the pitch and time and bring them in whenever I want, and even pulse them. I have some that I can, a sample that I can send through. If I'm getting a pulsing thing going with oscillators, I can take one of the samples that I was going to play and pass it through the oscillator to the Buchla so it gets pulsed instead of played in its normal form. So there's this array. It's like a set of available materials that I've been playing a lot lately. I've done 14, 15 performances in the last 3 or 4 weeks in that many cities. And so I have a sort of bag of tricks, although I try very much to have new stuff each time as I go.
Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, do you practice? And if you do practice, how do you practice? Like, do you practice technique the way a traditional instrumentalist does?
No. I do practice, but not the way an instrumentalist does. I develop technique, a new technique to do a particular kind of thing, and I get really good at it. I don't know how I'm going to use it, and then it gradually moves itself into a performance. But I never play from beginning to end 45 minutes for a 45-minute show. I never know how long the show is going to go, but I practice and try out little parts of it and go back and build a new technique if I don't like quite what I'm doing. It's really, I really have to, you don't get rid of everything you've learned, but you have to sort of, for me, come up with a new procedure. Because if I'm going to actually practice, as I used to on the clarinet, I'm going to end up with doing the same performance over and over again. Then it might well be a recording at that point.
Hi. You have a very well-developed philosophy about sound and music, and you use the words awe and ecstatic, and some of your peers, Lamont Young, Terry Riley, Pauline Oliveris, have developed a spiritual philosophy to do with sound in their music. Have you also?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
No, I have an allergy to saluting officers and to religion. So I prefer to think of when I go to a restaurant, I cannot stop marveling how we were in trees hanging by our tails, and now we're actually sitting at tables. You know, the degree, you know, or howling at the moon, or screaming or cooing, and then somehow made the Eroica Symphony down the line. The awe I have of the human being is through the natural evolution, which is, for me, a much more, if there is a spirituality, that to me is the awe experience is that we got to where we are. And to tell you the truth, that we're still here with all the crazy people running this world, that we managed to be sitting here talking like this. That's really amazing. Let's hope it keeps going.
Thank you.
You know, I'm going to have to stop soon.
Yeah, there's just 2 more questions.
Okay. Hi. You mentioned that you use samples. I didn't know earlier you were talking about the visual element. I didn't know, have you ever experimented with, you know, if you assigned a certain visual to a certain sound, you know, you can use samplers in conjunction with, you know, visual processors or whatever, like the Roland and the Adderall, something like that. If you like what you think about the concept of one sound being associated with one image or one clip, or should audio and visual always be like a separate and separately developed, two separately developed ideas, or
Yeah. You're thinking of something like the color organ with Scriabin and that kind of stuff. Personally, I'm opposed to that kind of locked in for myself. I'm perfectly happy when someone else does it. But for myself, I think gesturally. And I think of timbre, for instance, as the result of gesture, not as a pure thing. So, all this dimensional stuff. It's not or ooh. It's the combination of these things. And so color has this, but they're not the object of a particular sound. So I like it, for instance, if the sound is producing what you want it to produce, you don't need a color with it. But if I say, oh, and I do this, I need that kind, that's not doing the same thing my voice is. It's responding emotionally the same way and doing something. Because I could go, oh, or, oh, and all that means something different where the voice was almost the same. And that's where I think the visual, the color and all that can amplify or give more dimensions to the experience. That's how I use color.
But at the root of it, you want sound to be the color. You want sound to be the visual.
I want sound to be sound. And the expression underneath can be also done with a visual. It's the parallel aspect of it. You can hear it, and you should get something. But what happens when you add something to a musical experience, whether it's dance or you begin to begin to develop a large context in which people can actually build more context than they can with the sound. And it's particular with theatrical situations. Whereas if you only want the music to communicate, I don't use anything in addition to the music. If you want it to go beyond that in the more public arena, that's where I use visuals. Where you want a more composite experience that will bring more context to each individual, then you need to bring in more things. Like, I could tell you exactly what I'm saying, and you could just listen to it, but when you watch me say it, you get more context to it. You understand more about what it is, but it isn't necessary to get the message. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Morton.
Thank you.